Victony Victano here, the internet's least fucked by bears music nerd, and it's getting tense in here, as it's time to review this album by Scott Walker, Bish Bosch. Let me begin by saying that back when I embarked on this completely ludicrous and lamentable project, I did it with the anticipation of getting to express so overtly my feelings and thoughts toward such an album, and several others to follow for sure. But given that after a sequence of entirely new musical discoveries, this is an album I was acquainted with, it was a challenge to look forward to, one to both get excited about and to dread at least a fair bit. These are 2 pages I wrote back in 2012 when the album finally sank in, and to my recollection it might have been the last time I tripped out so much over an album. Now, while I could have done extensive research as to augment the review of this artist and this album, its context and ramifications, I mostly decided against it, since you will either already have knowledge of both the past and present manifestations of this music personality, or will have stuck your nose directly into this distinct opus. Quite likely both possibilities leading to the same results. Of course, artistic context is often important and should enrich the understanding of a work, but I'm always doubtful it can trump the actual experience of what you're listening and what you take from it, and I'm sure this will apply to the majority of you. Nevertheless, I can offer some light bullet points, as Scott Walker first achieved acclaim with the trio the Walker Brothers, whose members you might think were actually named Walker and were actual brothers, yet you could be wrong about that. A sort of typical pop band for that period that proved especially faddish in the UK in spite of the Beatles' dominion at that time. Scott then branched out and started his solo career during the late 60s with a string of 4 self-titled pearls, nearly uniform in their beauty, flair, and stylish adaptation of Baroque pop, with lavish orchestral arrangements on the first 2, followed by more rock and folk-oriented arrangements on the later ones, mirroring Scott's own transitions from singing mostly covers towards developing a more personal craft. There's intense serenading, and there's Scott's unmistakable, note-perfect croon, with a lyrical elegance and emotivity that's quite hard to rank with too many other acts, even for that period, give or take Tim Buckley and a few others, while emulating at times directly masters of the modern French chansons such as Jacques Brel, Georges Brassens, or going in parallel with other chic pop rock contemporaries such as Jacques Dutronc. Then the 70s and early 80s showcased a reunion with the brothers and a bunch of other releases, which frankly I've never even picked to hear once so far. For the majority of those familiar with Walker, it's quite clear the main subject is the great divide between the early and most recent decades of his career, in which you could almost say that Walker did a whole 180 on everything. From his aura as a 60s golden-voiced idol with the best, most soulful tunes in the jukebox, to a suddenly most reclusive, mysterious figure, sort of the Terrence Malick of music, with meteoric releases at wide intervals of years, all of them seemingly drenched in dark art and defiantly experimental. And if you happen to follow this chronologically and think to yourself after 1996's Tilt and 2006's The Drift that this slope couldn't possibly descend any further, Bish Bosch pretty much came out in 2012 as a whole new behemoth, ready to challenge taste and perception once more, whilst splashing the waves enough to generate, just like on the previous occasions, its share of critical acclaim, frenzy, confoundment, and even a bit of swag, with ripples that, if you take a minute to think about it, might have influenced other mature artists to let loose and access their darkest chambers of artistic expression. There is of course no shortage of grisly material on this album. The endurance and tolerance it demands, clocking past 70 minutes, though most of the swelling is due to the giant over 20-minute track that's placed in the middle. The combination of both accustomed and bizarre instrumental textures, all benefiting from very sparse, abstract arrangements. Scott's inflexible, aching vocalizes, and, perhaps as the biggest load on the scale, a lyrical content that's bordering on incomprehensibility. The idea of processing all this could be so noteworthy with this particular recording that it often reminds me of an anecdote way back when I was 16 and had read Ulysses, the James Joyce novel, a book I scarcely remember much from now, much as I'm fated with most of my readings, but which at that time was like the opium I was never high on, enough to make me consider it as one of the greatest books ever written. Anyway, also around that time, a poet who was a family friend and also a distant acquaintance of mine visited us, and the Ulysses topic came up, to which he oracularly said, "My dear boy, Ulysses is about what you want it to be. It is what it is, and it is not what it is." If there are any musical works for which this concept could apply, Bish Bosch could very well be amongst them. It may sound like a cop-out mentality, but I feel it actually goes back to the experience trumps cognizance argument I made, in that what you get from it may be all there is to it for you. A better question might be if any of this material is worth acknowledging and engaging with. And from a subjective viewpoint, I must confess I always find myself in a predisposed mindset. Everything about it I've mentioned so far, its haunting, depressing, dissonant features, its discard and deviance from traditional aesthetics, are all things that have their place in music history, while our main impulses drive us to search for the palatable, harmonious, catchy, beautiful and blissful in music and art. Let's not forget that there is a whole lot of friction and in both the past century or so of history, as well as the human psyche and whatever expressions or statements artists might try to conjure, reach out to, or simply fiddle with. Again, it would be fascinating to look into what drove Scott Walker down this path, as most artists usually strive for the bold, the revolutionary, or the questionable early on in their career, after which they can flatten out, fall back in line with the trends, or even sell out, while Walker seems to have matured in the complete opposite direction. That being said, if you look past the perception of this steep alteration and listen carefully, his Baroque tetralogy has a whole lot of spleen and melancholy on its own. It just happens to be wrapped up in a candid, time-honored song format. The first track on Scott Free, It's Raining Today, has this shockingly eerie, cluster-like string harmony that I'd rather expect to hear from a classical modern piece such as Penderecki's Threnody, Scott Free itself being probably the most introspective and bitter album of the bunch. So what if the seeds of so-called darkness were always there? What if Scott excelled at this modern minstrel act just as much as he satirized the whole shtick? On the other hand, the first album to be catalogued as experimental, Tilt, is not really devoid yet of conventional forms that could count as simple, sad songs. It's really the drift and Bish Bosch that plummet decisively into the eccentric and unsettling. Most of the time the drift sounding way more implacable to me than this album does. At their worst, in terms of sensations, Bish Bosch can feel very anaerobic, in the sense of projecting you into the vast vacuum of space, while the drift had actual moments in which I felt that I am choking up. Going back to the question over whether this weird spectacle is to be accepted as eloquent, or rather as balderdash, I think other factors are to be also taken into account. The lyrics, for example, however rough and impossible to follow they may be, apart from a few punchlines. It's dense, pain is not alone. Sorry, take that accidentally in the buttocks for a start. While I am the absolute suck at following or understanding lyrical content, if there is a track that betters my impression, it would actually be the last one on this album, an obviously flippant idea of a Christmas song with very little elements of an actual carol, but instead relating a historical event that happens to be close to home, the capture and execution of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife during the revolution. Yes, folks, we got rid of them on Bloody Christmas Day. Something that eluded me at first, possibly given the misleading lack of diacritics in the title, but has since opened my perspective with its main lyrics in the format of a survey with tick boxes that could relate to Ceausescu's well-known cult of personality, and its single chorus line, "Nobody waited for fire," that could relate to the execution squad emptying out its load right away, which would be a cynical and potentially true take on how even righteous rebels can have murderous instincts. So if I was able to extract this much out of such a jest of a song, what stops me from believing the same goes for the rest of the lyrical content on this album? However absurd and grotesque, it may also be hermetical and erudite, with penchants for wordplay, allusions, references, alliterations, and various word constructs. Several big themes surely edge out, very neat ones too, such as and the amount of minuteness and cleverness to them might be, from Scott's perspective, inexhaustible. The same could go for the instrumentals. Despite their weird coagulation and unhinged mixes, I wouldn't call them in any way insubstantial, but rather very scripted by Scott's vision, and with an outlandish reach, from heavy rock riffs and jazz blares to microtones, noise, use of objects such as ram horns and machetes, or effects such as that of Watching the trailer video released for the album could certainly inspire you to believe that every single detail was put in its designated spot. Yet, even after breaking it down so much, it should still boil down to the big verdict. Is this satisfactory and enjoyable? And I would say the answer for the most part is yes. While I cannot claim a shred of discernment towards the main epic, Zircon, a Flagpole Sitter, it has that cheeky, loopy, darkly fun, scatterbrained, complex vibe that I could only trace back to, say, Supper's Ready or Porn Hearts. For all its scabrous content and pitch black atmosphere respectively, the tracks Corpse de Black and Dimple displayed the perfect synthesis of Walker's vocal and instrumental peculiarities, and surely I can't let a song such as Phrasing go with its very gloomy refrain. That short moment of mix with whatever carnival-like dance percussions were used is just... I can't even. There are more minor tracks such as the opener or Pilgrim, both infectiously obstinate and churning. And Epizootics is just fucking believable. The video for it too, quite Lynchian perfection. A near deconstruction of a catchy piece, from thundering, bellowing jazz beats that devolve into the faintest, most sinister heaves, only to blow up once more. And how this track ends is... So I think I've pleaded enough for the believability of this project. It is bizarre, eccentric, risque and challenging, though not singular. Even from that ear I've rated higher stuff like Swans, or acoustic experiments from Keith Rowe, or the usual highs for me in free jazz. But I believe this to be a most methodical project from Scott Walker, willingly uncompromising and self-aware of its acquired taste. There is nothing here that has not defined Scott Walker so far, or won't continue to do so. And since deep down I'm sensing the same golden voice that always existed, I don't see why he shouldn't be considered alongside other dark crooners of recent pop music such as Nick Cave or Morrissey, even if this material gravitates more towards the spheres of Sun, Current 93 or Teardo. And if in the long run Bish Bosch would count as the small Ulysses of contemporary music, I wouldn't complain much about it. I'm feeling a light to decent 8 on this.
Transition. Hey everybody, don't mind me, just hiding under the sheets from the demons of Bish Bosch. Anyway, what did you think about this album? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. Hit the dislike if you dislike. And what should I review next? If anything, you know, maybe it's time to let it go, do something else, get life. But until you say so, Victony Victano, Scott Walker, Bish Bosch. Never ever.